Professor Kavita Khory teaches about politics at Mount Holyoke College, and she also runs its McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives. Her body of work is wide-ranging. Our recent discussion focused on a part of the world that's not often discussed in U.S. reporting, South Asia. I first asked her how she became interested in the region.
I grew up in Karachi, Pakistan. I was born and raised there, and then at the age of 18, I came to Mount Holyoke as an undergraduate. And given the fact that I had grown up in Karachi and witnessed firsthand many of the conflicts, political developments that had taken place over the years, and before the age of 10, I had lived through 2 wars. And Pakistan, as I'm sure many of your viewers are aware, for most of its history has been ruled by military regimes. It is now a democracy. And so I think being in the thick of things and experiencing in our daily lives so much of the sort of the chaos, but also the sort of the politics, the protests, the demonstrations. And the last part of it that got me really interested in thinking about South Asian security issues, and I'm going to date myself a little bit over here, was the Soviet war in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. And it was impossible to escape from these larger, I think, political trends and security developments that were taking place. And it's sort of, it's something that I just really wanted to get a handle on. And I think, as I tell my students over here, it's one thing to live through those experiences. And those lived experiences are crucial in many ways. But I think the way I really began to think about them in a more analytical way is after coming to Mount Holyoke, and even more so when I went for my doctorate to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And that's where I really began to wrestle with the questions that continue to animate my teaching and my research today, namely South Asian security issues, issues of political violence, insurgency movements, all of those things.
And we'll talk about a few of those in a moment.
Absolutely.
But as you mentioned, you're a student.
Yes.
But now you're also a professor at Mount Holyoke,
Correct.
and you lead the McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives.
That's correct.
Which it's been there for 15 years, but I don't know that many people in the region outside of Mount Holyoke are very familiar with the center. What's the goal? What's the driving force behind it?
Well, the McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives, as the name suggests, brings different global initiatives together on campus. So, for example, we are the Center for Study Abroad, for global internships for our students, for international students. Mount Holyoke has nearly 30% of our student body is international. So right there, we are global in many respects. But more than that, we are a place that brings together students and faculty for intellectual engagement, intellectual debates. We have a global scholar in residence who comes annually. We have major conferences where we bring scholars to campus to discuss issues that are in the headlines. So, for example, we have had conferences on migration. We have had conferences on the rise of China long before anyone was thinking about the rise of China, on the future of jobs. And I think one of the things that we do is it's not simply about our students at Mount Holyoke. We bring the world to Mount Holyoke. We take Mount Holyoke out into the world, and through our public programming, through our faculty, through our students, we engage with the 5 colleges and the larger community in the area itself. Our events are open to the public, and they are very well attended by the public. And since I'm on your show here, I hope more and more people will pay attention to the kinds of things that we're doing, our public events, and also the faculty and students who are a fabulous resource. Our students also go out and work in the communities. We have a fabulous global local program where students who do internships abroad then come back and link that experience with work in the community itself, and also experiences through coursework.
Pivoting back to your area of research, right. South Asia. I think people in the United States often think of Afghanistan and Pakistan as parts of the Middle East. Does that drive you crazy?
Well, you know, these are sort of, in some ways, these are geographical constructions. And even South Asia, in many respects, is a relatively new construction. That's post-colonial construction, and it's very much rooted in sort of Cold War politics and the way in which which I think people have thought about the world. And yes, and I think it does sometimes sort of drive me crazy, but on the other hand, I think it's also important to keep in mind that I think regions are not bounded, and that the way in which we think about them, the way in which politics transcend borders, I think it's very difficult to sort of close off particular regions and say this is the Middle East, or this is Southwest Asia, or this is South Asia. These boundaries are fluid, and what happens within countries inevitably, I think, spills over across boundaries as well. And we see that happening in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and I think it's impossible to talk about South Asia today without taking China into account, one of the three nuclear powers in South Asia, India and Pakistan being the other two, without talking about Iran, without talking about Russia. So I think in some ways we have to be more, I think, flexible in the way in which we think about the region itself.
Yeah, and then how those areas then link to the larger global society. Security challenges in South Asia is really a large area of your research. Insecurity is often a matter of perspective. How do threat perceptions differ from country to country?
Right. I think that's a great question. I think when we start thinking about security, too, the first question always is, whose security are we talking about? Are we talking about state security, society's security, or individual, and ordinary people like us? I think right there, that's a different perspective, depending on that vantage point. The other part of it that I think it's important to take into consideration is that the world looks very different from Islamabad, or Kathmandu, or Colombo, or New Delhi. So, for example, if you were to talk about to a Pakistani government official, the first thing you would hear is principal threat, India, right? You go to New Delhi, Indians will say, well, you know, the major threat is China and the way in which they think about the world. So right there you have it. And then when you sort of look at the smaller states in South Asia, like Sri Lanka, like Nepal, I think the way in which they would think about their security priorities and threat perceptions would be quite different. So I think right there, it's a very complex understanding of what security is when you've got such a diverse range of countries as societies and states.
And when you think about that diversity, you think, oh, differences, things that divide them. But then you also point out that there are common problems that they share. What are some of those?
I think it's not only about sort of the common problems, but it's also common cultures, common languages, I think common ways of thinking. And I think when we think about sort of common problems, I think there's a list of them that I'll just forced migration, refugees, demographic pressures, urbanization, climate change, which is a very big one, environmental pollution, inequality, poverty, sort of the list goes on. And I think what many of us find very frustrating is that I think, by and large, states in the region continue to think of security in very traditional military terms. Whereas I think the problems that are the most urgent in so many respects are precisely these problems that go across state and territorial boundaries and that impact all of the South Asians in one way or another. And I think the emphasis and the stress on traditional security, on building up the military, means that human development and human security is being neglected. And I think that's a huge problem.
Do you see any inroads into addressing the latter that you just discussed?
I think there are. I think there are some, there's some regional initiatives. But I think, again, and I think countries are trying to work on all of these issues individually. Okay? I mean, again, looking at sort of climate change. No one in South Asia is going to tell you that climate change isn't happening. And it's a very urgent issue right there, okay? So they're sort of individual countries are working on these issues individually. Countries are grappling with refugees individually. Some of the largest refugee populations today are in South Asia, okay? Pakistan still has nearly 1 million Afghan refugees. We have the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, right? So, but I think, again, I think part of the real issue is the lack of cooperation on these, I think, really critical security issues. And the reason why there is such a lack of cooperation, I think, is explained partly by the fact that you have India and Pakistan at loggerheads with each other. And I think that bilateral conflict, in many respects, has stymied the kind of regional cooperation that I think ordinary South Asians desperately want and are really advocating for.
Well, and I also hear you tick off that list of challenges in the region. If people didn't know we were talking about South Asia, they could think we were talking about the United States.
Absolutely, absolutely. Or any place in the world today. And I think the only way to tackle this is through cooperation, is through developing international norms, practices, rules, regulations. Those things matter. And I don't think we can seal ourselves off and pay attention to ourselves as individual countries. I think that time has long gone.